lucky enough tonight to have Simon Shake with us. Anybody know who he is? Nice. No, he's not Get Up. He used to be Get Up. And if you ask him why he used to be Get Up and he's now moved on to be the founder of Future Super, he will tell you that with Get Up, it used to be about hearts and minds. And he belted his head against people's hearts and minds for a while. Then he figured out that it might be a better way to get to them through their wallets. To tell us that story, we're going to get Simon to come up. Please give him a round of applause.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, and it's fantastic to be here amongst mostly kind of 55% hopeful people, and we'll ignore those who are trying to take us down. I want to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. We, of course, I'm sure all want to pay our respects to their elders, past and present. But I imagine in doing so, we want to do more than that. We want to take a second to actually reflect on the tens of thousands of years of Indigenous history, the tens of thousands of years of land management, of backburning operations, of sustainability. So many of the things that personally give me hope. The fact that we have survived, people have lived on this earth for so long. Surely there is some hope for the future, given that so much of what we have to do is learn from the past. Tonight, my role is to provide a broad overview, and I want to do that in a new framework. And I want to beg your pardon because it's the first time I've given voice to some of these thoughts, this particular framework. For many of us, including some of the speakers tonight, we look at the challenge of climate change as fundamentally about changing hearts and minds. Tonight, I want to talk about a different approach, although that's not to say we don't need to go and do that work. Of course, that's a big part of what we've got to do. But I want to contend to you that part of the challenge around how we change our energy system is about reflecting on tipping points, on social, cultural and economic tipping points, understanding what's happening in those three areas, working out whether it's for us or against us. If it's working in our favour, how do we bring it forward? If it's working against us, how do we reduce the power or reduce the influence? And most importantly, how do we think about what our enemies, if you like, are going to do when some of these tipping points emerge? And one of them emerged just today with the article that was put up on the screen earlier, and I'll talk about that in a second. So thinking briefly about that, before I do so, you might be wondering why am I now talking about these kinds of issues? It was mentioned earlier that I left Get Up a couple of years ago and have been working to launch Australia's first fossil fuel-free superannuation fund. It's called Future Super. It's really exciting. It's the first time in this country that we've been able to get a super fund that's completely divested of fossil fuels. There have been some that have gotten close, but not any that have gotten over the line. I don't want to talk too much about that tonight, so if you do want to hear more about it, there's an iPad that's going to start flowing around. It'll pass along, so if you could just pass it on as you go, enter your details, and I'll get in touch and tell you a little bit more about that. Saves me going through it all here. So let's start with social tipping points. What I see going on around us is quite extraordinary. One of the most important things we're seeing in our politics is the largest number of voters than we've ever seen in Australian history voting informally, not turning up to vote in the first place, or voting for people like Clive Palmer. And so what does that mean? Well, it's obviously both a threat and an opportunity. Of course it's a threat. We know it's a threat because this disengagement makes it very difficult to communicate with people, to say, hey, we need to do something on this. But our challenge is to try and turn it into an opportunity. And that's what we've seen with groups like Solar Citizens, who will talk this evening, who've done awesome work in Clive Palmer's electorate, turning around his views. That's the type of work that's strategic. It's about understanding that there's been a tipping point. There's been a political, a social tipping point. There's been a view that's formed that politicians are hopeless. So what are we going to do in that context? We're going to have to convince those politicians that benefit from that tipping point. And I contend it is a tipping point. I don't see us turning this around. Therefore, we've got to take those people who've got that view, like Clive Palmer, who've got that position, and switch their views. That's a huge opportunity, but of course a threat. In the cultural space, the tipping points that are emerging are up to us to go and create. Divestment from fossil fuels, the thing that I'm most passionate about now, actually fits within this space. And it draws its history back, as you know, to the apartheid movement One of the most important things that happened during apartheid was the realisation by people outside of South Africa that companies they were supporting were involved in supporting the South African regime. One of the first was a factory worker. One of the first group of people were a group of factory workers on the factory floor of Polaroid. I don't know if anyone's heard this story, but at Polaroid, a group of workers realised, they heard, they read, they got informed that the work they were doing was supporting identity checks that were happening in South Africa. And so they organised their workplace. It started small. They put pressure on their bosses. Suddenly more and more people started thinking, hey, that's an innovative thing. I didn't think there was anything I could do about apartheid all the way over there in South Africa, but maybe I've got to stop buying Polaroid. More and more campaigns like this emerged, and then people had the realisation that capital markets are hugely useful. So more and more people then started moving their funds out of companies and major endowments and investments, pressuring people to shift their funds away from apartheid-supporting institutions. This, as Nelson Mandela, as Desmond Tutu have said both recently, or rather in the last 10 years, and Desmond Tutu recently, was a hugely influential aspect of changing the game when it came to apartheid. And I contend that it can be a hugely important thing for us to do now. Imagine a future 5, 10 years from now where you turn to the person next to you and they've shifted their bank because they were disgusted that one of the big 4 banks they were with was investing still these days in the morally corrupt fossil fuel industry. Imagine that person has also shifted their superannuation, hopefully to Future Super, but hopefully by then any number of other institutions who are fossil fuel free. Imagine their children have done that. Imagine their parents have done that. All of a sudden, if you haven't done that, you're thinking to yourself, all of these people around me have gone to this extraordinary effort to go that far. That's what I think will emerge as a cultural tipping point. And just finally, and by the way, another cultural tipping point that other people are going to talk about tonight is when communities own renewable energy. Because this is another huge aspect of the change that we have to create. Imagine if all of us were making money, small amounts, but making a positive return on investment out of a micro investment in solar, out of a micro investment in wind. That's the type of thing, again, that's going to change hearts and minds. The final tipping points our next speaker is actually going to talk about, which are the economic tipping points that are happening. Let me wrap up by saying this about economic tipping points. The IMF, the OECD, Stanford University, HSBC, Citibank, the World Bank, the President of the World Bank, all of these institutions of people have warned that there is an extraordinary shift going on in our economy that risks stranded assets emerging. And what that means is that we're going to see the coal industry fall apart. We're going to see huge bubbles emerge. And so what have we got to do? Well, of course, that gives me some hope that those tipping points are emerging, but we want to make sure we aren't affected by that. And just today we saw, and I'll wrap up here, just today we saw an article all over the place saying that China has now emerged as banning the worst of dirty coal. Now when you've got economies that can move that quickly, we've got to make sure that we stay ahead of the game. Because of those tipping points emerging, I have great hope. I hope you too as well, and enjoy the evening. Thank you.